Man, I am so excited that all of you actually showed up to my office hours. Fair warning, there is a little bit of delay here. I need to figure out how to get this to have less delay. I think that'll be easier to interact with the chat, but I think this is delayed, I don't know, maybe 5 seconds or so. So first stream, we'll figure out how to optimize it. I also have YouTube warning me my backup stream is set up incorrectly. And so we all know how important backups are. So hopefully the stream stays up, and I'll figure this out and get this down. So this is kind of the first shot at it. But wow, you guys are crazy. Less than 24-hour, 48-hour notice, and y'all showed up to a random office hours with very little plan, and really just kind of wanted to show you guys behind the scenes on how I make these Power BI templates, and stuff like that. So hopefully there should be a chat. I think I have the chat up. If you could, just to test the chat, I know we have folks from across the globe, which is kind of crazy. So if you're able to put in the chat here, kind of where you're tuning in from, whether that's a state, whether that's a $100 gift card you promised. Yeah, you got to love those, right? Or the coffee mugs or the shirts and all that kind of stuff. So, and then let me know if the audio's too loud or the stream kicks off. Hopefully, I got it hooked up to the Ethernet. Hopefully, we're good to go. Denver, Florida, SoCal, nice. London, I like it, man. Man, it's like middle of the night there. Audio is good. Okay, sweet. And then I don't have a huge plan for this, really. So part of it is kind of answering your guys' questions. Definitely, happy if this goes on a totally different direction. Throw any questions you have in the chat, whether it's related to what we're talking about or looking at or not, right? But really, the goal is just to kind of give you guys a glimpse behind the scenes. Recently made an attack surface discovery template, kind of using the tool AMAS from OWASP. So we can take a look at that, kind of look behind the scenes. What does the data model look like? How the heck does it work? And hopefully you guys learn something to make these for yourself as well, right? Because I think there's a ton of great stuff we can do with Power BI, especially in cybersecurity. It's a skill not everybody has, right? And so I think it's something that can really be beneficial. There's a ton of really expensive tools out there. We can get pretty darn close with Power BI, is what I've learned. Netherlands, I like it. I like it. Oh, that's awesome. So, without further ado, let's see if I can get my screen shared out here. Actually, first, so I'm assuming all you here know a little bit about me, right? But I make Power BI templates for cybersecurity, and I thought it'd be fun. I've been doing this for, well, gosh, I started way back in an internship, 4 or 5 years ago. But I first came up with the idea for using Power BI for cybersecurity around a NIST CSF assessment. And I used to do these back when I was doing consulting work, and we do NIST CSF assessments, and our deliverables were like 70-page PDF reports. And that's great, right? You need all that detail in the actual deliverable. But I don't think anyone really wants to read those. And I always kind of wondered, does anyone actually read that stuff? And it'd be really, there's got to be a better way to kind of showcase that stuff. And so I started playing around um, with using Power BI, and I posted a work in progress on LinkedIn, gosh, maybe a year and a half ago. I don't know if anyone was there for the original NIST CSF, but I thought I pulled up a video from it so we can take a look. Hopefully that's sharing out for you guys. This was the original version I posted maybe a year and a half ago on LinkedIn. And I think we can all agree it doesn't look great. It's not bad, right? But this is kind of what kickstarted this whole journey for me. So I thought it'd be kind of fun to take a look back, gotten a little better at it, and that's kind of how you learn a lot of this stuff, right? Is just doing it over time. And that's kind of partly why I wanted to start this office hours thing, and we'll see if we turn it into a monthly series or what. Hopefully, it's somewhat helpful for you guys and worth spending 30 minutes, an hour with me. But I always get asked, like, can you teach a class on how to make these? Or, are you gonna, can you teach me how to do this somehow? And I'd love to, but the reality is I don't really know how to teach people how to do this. The only way I know how is the way I learned, right? Which is just doing it over time. You rinse and you repeat, you get better each time you do it. You learn what works well, what doesn't work well. And so hopefully this will be kind of helpful and trying to figure out how can I help enable other people to do this as well. And I don't have a great answer. So without further ado, let me try to catch up on the chat here. Also here for the $100 gift card. Look what you started, Dan. I got to give out $2,000 to do this, right? Yeah, started something $100. In other words, what do you find some of the best resources to continue learning new capabilities and tricks of the trade? YouTube is great. There's one channel. Gosh, what is it called? Let me find it real quick. Guys in a Cube, I believe. Um, these guys work at Microsoft on the Fabric or Power BI team. Guys in a Cube, I believe. Guy in a Cube. My bad. It is two guys, but it's Guy in a Cube. They have a great channel as well. The documentation's great as well. A lot of what I find too is when you just start working on something, you'll run into the challenges, right? Where it's like, man, I wish could it do this, or how could I make it do that? And then it's finding those challenges, and then that's where you learn new stuff, right? And so I think never letting don't try to stick to the confines of what you know the tool can do. Figure out what you want it to do, and then figure out if there's a way. Power BI is the world of workarounds as well. So there's crazy workarounds. I've seen people turn bar charts into like all kinds of crazy different charts. And that's actually an interesting piece. I went down a bit of a rabbit hole there with the attack surface discovery template as well, where the data is actually a graph database. And that is challenging, I've learned in Power BI, is it does not handle graph data very well. So I went a whole rabbit hole of, well, I can pull in and create my own visuals in Vega or Vega Lite. And there's some from the marketplace. And I eventually found one from the marketplace that worked pretty well for the use case. But yeah, you'll run into some of those things, but there's always some sort of workaround or way to do it. And then almost everything is can be a parameter or dynamic. So even if it's just titles and text and things like that, and so that can help make it more flexible. And then the other thing I'd say is just general, the hardest part of this stuff is not necessarily making it, but is coming up with the initial design on how do we present the information effectively. And so I think if people spend more time, optimizing how is this laid out, what are the workflows that the average user is going to go through to use it, I think that's beneficial as well. But Guy in a Cube is a fantastic resource. And their documentation as well. And then the user groups too. So there's like Fabric user groups that have some fantastic people in there and forums and stuff like that. NCSC CAF framework is replacing NIST in the UK. That's actually really helpful. So and I have a whole backlog of UK stuff as well. I can only keep track of so many compliance frameworks. So it's actually really helpful, especially for folks outside of the United States. That's actually how the Essential 8 one started. Is I had a ton of people from Australia say, "Hey, can you make this?" And I had no idea what it was, so I had to go learn what the Essential 8 was as well. So that's actually really helpful. Um, what others here are being asked for, NIST or CA? Other templates, I get a ton, pretty much every compliance regulation like under the sun. So there's a ton of stuff in the UK. I can't remember them off the top of my head that gets asked for. There's some other ones in Australia that get asked for. The one I get asked for all the time is ISO, ISO cybersecurity. That one I would love to do ISO. The challenge is always the licensing. So like the CIS controls, I had to go get a license for. And luckily, they made it pretty easy. So shout out to them. But for the control, CIS controls, I do have the proper licensing to distribute that. ISO, I've really struggled getting the licensing to distribute the framework in that fashion. It is something I continue to work towards because that one I get asked for probably daily or weekly to do that one as well. Yeah, 27,000. I get asked that all the time. The challenge really there is licensing. I do it in a heartbeat if it wasn't, and that's because it's not open source. So the NIST stuff, right, is essentially open source. So I can distribute the frameworks there. ISO 27,000 is closed sourced. So I got to get the proper licensing. And technically, because the compliance templates, right, use an Excel backend there, I am technically, distributing the 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 template there. So, or maybe I could do a bring your own ISO. I don't know. I gotta look into that. But Jim, Jim, you joined. Welcome, man. OSA census data. Yeah, yeah. And the one thing about Power BI too, so there's kind of two sides of the like data visualization in my experience, right? There's like the exploratory stuff and then there's the explanatory stuff. So a lot of like data analysts, right? What they're going to do is they're going to analyze data, put together some sort of report, and they're really going to tell a story. So if anyone's interested in that kind of stuff, Storytelling with Data is a phenomenal book. That's kind of the Bible of data analysis or kind of data analyst roles in my experience. Does a great job outlining how do you tell that story? How do you call out the data? To really tell a story and come to some sort of action item, right? Or some sort of call to action that you want folks to have. The dashboarding side is really more, and especially from the template perspective, right? Because I don't know exactly what your data or your results are, is more exploratory. That is something I'm also looking into is how do I develop templates that let you tell a more specific story, right? So if we look at we can dashboard the results of the CSF assessment, for example, but how do you actually tell the story of what that means? How do you actually analyze it instead of requiring the user to kind of explore and analyze it for themselves and come to some sort of conclusion there? So maybe I'll find out a good way to do that as well. Yeah, ISO 27 tricky with the license. That's you can only use the paragraph names exactly, and that's I don't know. Maybe that would be fine, but that doesn't seem really useful to me. So I'm still marching down that path, and I knock on wood. Hopefully, one day I'll figure out the licensing for that. Can you talk more about what they consider distributing? Yeah, so ISO. Well, and I'm not the I don't know the details, so maybe folks in the comments actually know a little bit better. But the way they license it is actually to the individual. So if you have like multiple individuals using the framework, they all have to have their own license. And you purchase a document and you get like a PDF essentially of the framework, maybe some other resources, and they like watermark it with the person's name who it's licensed to. So you're technically supposed to have like, you know, uh, your own individual document if you're referencing or using it. Um, but the way and it's kind of an interesting use case, right? They do have some licensing for like, so you have like GRC tools out there, like, I don't know, there's like Manta, there's all kinds of them that you like, they will license it, but it's a little bit of a different use case, right? But essentially what I'm doing is I'm taking the content out of that PDF, putting it in an Excel sheet, and then I'm distributing it, the content where they should have a license. Um, in theory, right, it could be a thing where it's like, hey, you have to have or actually go purchase the ISO license to use this. But they're really tough with the licensing, and so trying to figure that out. Cyber Essentials, yes, Nick. That's the other one I get asked for a lot. Thank you for. I was trying to remember what it was. Yes, Cyber Essentials in the UK. Um, Active and takedown requests. Yeah, they're not. It's tough, but it's so common, especially outside the United States. I know that's definitely um, ISO is kind of the go-to there. Tuning in from Indianapolis, we use an in-house framework developed by our parent company. Okay, I would love to be able to report dashboard that other subs could use to visualize compliance. And it's an in-house framework. Yeah, that's interesting. Jack. And that's one thing I've also thought about, right? Is like, how do you create a template that you can, I don't know, essentially bring your own framework? One of the things I've been kicking around, there's like unified compliance frameworks where essentially what they do is they have the control and then, or like a unified kind of control, and then they map it to all the different compliance frameworks and regulations and things like that. So that it's essentially crosswalking, right? There's some that are commercial. There is one that's open source, the Secure Controls Framework. that I've thought about creating a template around, right? Because then you could look at it from the control perspective. We could crosswalk across different compliance frameworks. Um, and then in theory, you could also use that, right? If you map your in-house framework to the unified kind of controls. I'm not 100%. I still need to do some validation that like the secure controls framework is um, a good resource, right? I know the compliance force, kind of the folks behind it, usually make some pretty good stuff. I don't know enough about it or like how frequently it's updated and stuff like that. Do you have any dashboards that address security risk exceptions management? Sort of. I do have a risk register template that I kicked around. That was speaking of the roadblocks that I think that was Dan who kicked off that conversation. That was another one of those, right? Where it's like the quintessential, and this is those risk register uses like your traditional risk matrix. So I know risk quantifications kind of the way the industry is moving, but a lot of folks still use um, kind of this qualitative risk management perspective. But getting an actual risk matrix in Power BI was very challenging actually. I had to like go like draft up an actual image to overlay behind it and use these crazy visuals. So there's always some sort of workaround. But that one uses an Excel based risk register. I found most folks are just find it easier to use an Excel based risk register. You host it in like OneDrive or SharePoint or something like that so you can collaborate with the team. Um, and then it'll graph out, got risk reduction and all kinds of stuff there. But it's not doing necessarily risk quantification, so like fair analysis or anything like that. Um, and then it's really just like kind of the register piece. But definitely, if you have ideas or requests, let me know. That's an area I'd really like to kind of dive more into as well is the risk analysis. And fair to that's the other challenge I found is the licensing for all these different frameworks and models. That's a whole challenge in itself. Kind of went through trying to get license fair methodology, and then all right, well, where are the open source stuff and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of interesting. The different licensing. It's a world I wasn't really exposed to before, and so trying to navigate that's is interesting. All right. Well, let's get into. I'll talk a little bit. Definitely throw any other um, questions, thoughts in the chat. Open fair. Well, that's interesting. So is open fair? I mean, that's still the same. So maybe I don't need to. Let me check that out. Okay. Yeah, because open fair is. Yeah, is that open source? Because I think that's the same methodology as fair. I remember when I was looking into it, fair did require some sort of licensing to use it in a product. So let me look into that more. Um, and I'm not sure exactly how Fair Institute and Open Fair are related. PyFair, interesting. There's also, speaking of PyFair, I'll check that out. I found, let me see if I can put a link in the chat. Um, uh, let's see if I can find it. Oh, come on. Okay, this will be my test of the chat and see if this works. Uh, all right, so I put a link in the chat, hopefully. Um, I actually came across what's really interesting is Netflix has on GitHub an open source risk quantification tool written in Python. So I'll have to check out PyFair. The Netflix one was kind of interesting. It's through their like Skunkworks group. Um, and so I'd never heard of that one. I'll have to kind of check that out. But if anyone's interested in more of the GRC engineering, automation kind of side of things. That one looks kind of interesting too. NIS2 directive. Okay, I'll check that one out. Not a framework, but still compliance. Gotcha. Yeah, maybe I should get. I get so many requests. Part of the challenge is just like aggregating all the requests, and I build most of these from requests, right? It is, what do you guys want me to build? If I get enough people hounding me on something, I'll kind of shortlist that on the list. Inputs are close to Python. Okay, it's probably a similar implementation there with the Netflix one. What did they call theirs again? I forgot. Risk Quant. But yeah, so I'm not exactly sure the methodology for loss. Yeah. There was another one. Dan, what are you excited to do next as a template? So I am taking a short break from the compliance side of things, even though I know I have a whole list of compliance stuff to do. One thing I'm interested in tackling is vulnerability management, vulnerability assessment. This is something I have a pretty big background in. So that's most of my background is doing uh, cybersecurity audit, compliance, GRC work, and then penetration testing, vulnerability assessment, vulnerability management. And this is an area that I have not seen great dashboarding or reporting come from, I think is a major challenge. And I think is pretty imperative for a vulnerability management program is like, how do we accurately report on not only what the findings are to the remediation teams or the asset owners, but also from a program perspective. And so that's something I'll be tackling first. I'll be starting with bringing kind of the enterprise vulnerability management dashboarding capabilities to Nessus scans, um, viewed as a standard commodity. I would agree. However, I think it's still a challenge, right? So I don't think a lot of people are doing it great. And they're charging a ton of stuff. Defender XDR report tool on, yeah, that'd be interesting. Um, yeah, 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 huge challenge. And so I at least want to bring like the enterprise style dashboarding that you'll see. There's only a few folks out there that really play in that space. Um, and so I want to bring those dashboarding out of their enterprise tools, right? So if you just have a Nessus scanner, how do we take that data and make it a lot better than it is? And bring dashboarding. How do we do distributed scanning? How do we merge scan reports together? And then I'll hopefully expand out of there. So I'm starting with Nessus just because I know the data model the best, and I know how it works. But there's a lot of other things there as well. Unified dashboard to pull VM risk and compliance into a single place. I have, and that is another ongoing R&D slash challenge. One of the ideas I've had, part of the challenge is from a template perspective. How do I create the semantic model and distribute it through like the template perspective with Power BI? So that's part of the challenge, right? Is well, you'd have to like build everything into a single app and distribute that, but maybe people only want certain pieces, and or maybe they're pulling in their VM data from tool X instead of tool Y, and that's where stuff can kind of challenging unless you're building it custom for an organization. So that's a lot easier to do if you say, hey, let's build that for our organization or our tech stack. It's a little bit harder from a distribution standpoint to do that universally across everyone. One thing I have been doing some, I would say, toying around or like R&D is essentially building an open source graph database for compliance, right? Where you have your policy statements, you have your controls, you have your compliance requirements, and then you can extend that out to we have our different assets, and then we have our additional information about those assets, and kind of open sourcing the data model around that. I don't know exactly how useful that would be yet, but that's one thing I've been kind of playing around with in Neo4j. I actually ran up a $2,000 bill in AWS playing around with that. So got to be careful with your cloud costs there. But um, LDAP HR data with vulnerability data. We can talk offline. Just join me some. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I like that. So LDAP from like Active Directory or whatever the directory is. Um, HR data. Yeah, that sounds awesome. Single semantic model makes sense. Community feed. Yeah, yeah. Stepping on service now too. Well, they, I'll take them on, I guess. If they're getting taken on by, a guy making Power BI dashboards out of his apartment. Like, that's great. You use graph and say align to the settings described in the CIS. So basically, man, I'm gonna get a whiteboard or something for the next one. The concept is that, so if you kind of think about how GRC's laid out, and I'm not the expert, so I'm sure I'm going to get corrected in the chat here. But in essence, we're going to have our controls that are going to be related to a requirement, and that requirement will be from either a compliance requirement, it could be regulatory, it could be an internal requirement, and then we're also going to have policy statements or procedure statements or some sort of governance documentation or statement in that documentation that's going to actually describe or require or outline that specific control. And then that control is going to be applied to assets. And then we're going to have other data sources that essentially validate those assets. And so with a graph database, and a quick question, who here is familiar with graph databases? Because that actually take us um, into some attack surface discovery stuff as well. But you have nodes, and then the nodes have properties. So think of the nodes as like, well, actually, here, um, let's get my screen share going here because if anyone's interested, all right, let's see if I can find this. And then let's get my right display. Boom, there we go. And then now I can't see the chat, so let's do this. Oops. That goes there, and then that goes there. Okay, this will work for now. This will work for now. Okay, so I actually wrote this like 6 years ago. So hopefully this is kind of I think it ranks on like the first page of Google or something on social, or essentially graph databases. At the time, it was really social network graphing is kind of what it's titled. Um, but essentially, you have these nodes, which are like objects, and then you have your edges, which are how are the objects related. And then an edge can have essentially properties or kind of metadata about it, and so can your node. And so all those different pieces, right? Policy statements would be a node, and they would be related to a control in some way, and that control will be related to a requirement in some way. That control will be related to an asset in some way. And so building out that kind of data model, and that lets you do interesting things, right? Like ask questions such as, you know, what policy statements actually are related to this requirement from the CIS controls or this requirement from PCI DSS, et cetera, right? And so you can start doing some interesting graph analysis and stuff like that. So a little bit of a different database, more of an R&D project. I don't know if that'll be useful or not, but kind of something I'm exploring is how graph databases can be used to represent compliance, since I feel like tables can be kind of challenging. If you look at the secure controls framework, they essentially lay that out in a massive Excel sheet, and it's kind of challenging. And really, all they're doing there is linking controls to the ID of some sort of requirement in a compliance framework. Data is relying more on connections. Doesn't it misrepresent or or misinterpret data? What's your opinion? Um, can you expand on that a little bit? I'm not quite sure exactly. I'd be interested to hear um, what you mean by that. A lot of it's more how is everything connected, right? How are our, is there government documentation? Um, our government documentation related to our controls, related to our compliance requirements, and then potentially assets or anything like that, and how you expand on that. So we'll see. It'll be R&D. Hopefully, you'll see some stuff. We'll explore, see if that makes sense. Um, all right. So speaking of graph databases, um, the recent project is how law enforcement use string court pictures evidence. Yeah, yeah, exactly, right. Yeah, yeah. How are you connecting things? There's also an interesting. I had a professor in university. So I went to the University of Arizona, and I took this class on machine learning and data analysis and stuff like that. Hardest class I ever took, and it was an elective too. But it was, man, it was really challenging. He would have us do novel research. We published research papers in undergrad. And he actually built a really interesting tool using social network analysis or essentially graph analysis to map out criminal networks for law enforcement. And so he created these tools, sold it to the government, I think, sold to some sort of public sector space, but it would essentially use similar similar methodology to track the relationships and groupings of criminal networks. So it was kind of interesting. So AMAS with the discovery template also uses graph databases to store it. Now they store it in a quasi graph database using a SQLite database. Really cool tool regardless. So if you use the template or not, this is I think an awesome tool. Um, I've been really looking into open source tools and how we build um, tools that give you a better UI or user experience. A lot of folks outside of the fact of there is always the support contract issue, right, with open source, especially in enterprise environments. But I feel like also part of it is a lot of this stuff is kind of stuck in the command line. And so how do we get it out of that and make it easier to navigate? But AMAS is an awesome tool, and they're essentially you provide a domain name, and it's going to go find public-facing IPs, network blocks, fully qualified domain names, um, and all those different resources so that you know about them. Right? A lot of folks don't know everything. You got mergers and acquisitions, and you don't know everything that's public-facing. You got someone who stood up um, a VM in Azure, something like that. And so I've always found it's kind of interesting to see what pops out here. But what's also interesting is they have an open asset model. So this is the graph database, so we can see what are the assets or the nodes here in this case that they'll support. They have these ones. But if you're interested in kind of open source graph databases, this is another one for kind of attack surface management stuff. Let's see, if something discussing today is where it's coming from. If data is more reliant on connections to different databases rather than tables, misinterpreted, it'd be great to know your opinion on if that's lower. All right, brother. No, you're not taking too much space. No, feel free. Um, okay, let's see. So if data is more reliant on connections between different databases rather than tables. Okay, so if we're harmonizing data from different databases, there is I don't know if it would be more what was misinterpreted. I don't know. I think that's a challenging, and it's a little bit different than a graph database is more of a different way to store data. And you can run some different stuff. So you can run like path analysis, or if anyone's seen like attack path analysis capabilities or tooling, that's all graph databases and graph analysis. Where you're looking at what's the shortest path or what's the blast radius. Um, you can look at connected components, right? And if we eliminate this node, what reduces connections between different connected components? And a connected component is essentially a group of nodes that are connected in themselves and not connected to the rest of it. Yeah, Bloodhound. Yeah, great one, John. Bloodhound is using that. So you'll see that as well in the identity stuff. So it's used a lot in identity. Um, Now, the question though, still, I think, is if there's data from different databases. I think the question is more of the sources, right? So that's where you get into like SIM had that challenge, right? Is like SIM tools have to normalize the data and then correlate it, right? And the correlation is kind of challenging. And so I think it's more about the data source. I don't think it matters if it's in a separate database or a separate table. Um, but correlating the data can be challenging. And so it's understanding what is the source data, how is it generated, and then making sure it's correctly correlating with itself, right? If timestamps are off, maybe asset identifiers aren't identical between the two sources. So I think that can be the challenge, right? Is how do you normalize the data, and then how do you correlate it? But that's a big piece of kind of what SIM tools, and that's still a challenge, right? It's getting your logs and your data in a unified kind of normalized format. Um, all right, so let's take. I'll kind of show you behind the scenes. This is the attack surface dashboard, and it's pretty straightforward, right? And we're really just looking at what are all of the, well, we're just hooking into the actual database, but it's what is all the public facing assets we found. So we can see our assets, we have some timestamps. What is the asset type, the value? We actually get a link to Showdown. So um, we can hop out here and take a look at this example. Example.com, of course, doesn't have a ton of resources there. Um, we can see the distribution. We can search here, which is helpful. So we can search example, and I'll show you why this is helpful in a second. It's because the output's pretty command line based. And so especially when we get larger data sets, that can be really challenging. Um, we also have date picker here, so I don't have a ton of data in here, but it will maintain a continuous database. So if we want to look at stuff over the last 30 days, last 12 months, um, I barely have any data in here in this kind of sample here. We can look at the graph, right? So we can see how things are graphed out. Example.com has 5 nodes, and these are probably IP addresses and well, that's a name server, and name servers and records, right? But how do we can look at different records here. This doesn't have everything, so you can also find MX records, which is pretty useful. But we might want to look at the relationships, right? So we can look at, well, let's just filter on maybe A and A records. As an example, we can see the graph there. We can see all the A records between the name servers and their IPs. Example.com and www also has an A record there. And then what's also useful is a target export list. And so the reason I put this in is finding out about stuff is kind of just one step of the challenge of the problem, right? What we really want to do is when we find out something exists, we want to analyze it and then figure out, hey, should this even exist in the first place? Maybe this is a server that no one knows exists. No one's managing it. We don't really need it. We kind of forgot it was even on and running. Let's just kind of decommission that and shrink our attack surface. Um, the other thing then is, okay, well, now we know what this is, and we do need it. Is should it even be public facing? Because keep in mind, all this stuff is public facing. I could run this AMAS tool against really any domain. It's using open source intelligence, which means attackers can find the exact same information just as easily. Should it really be public facing? I remember we did essentially a tech surface discovery engagement for a client before, and they had a bunch of print servers that were public facing. And we're going, why are these accessible from the internet? And they really, well, we didn't even know they were, right? And so, well, let's not put those on essentially a public IP, right? Um, but that's kind of the other question. And then if it is, well, we want to wrap it up into some sort of vulnerability management program. And so the question really is, we know this stuff exists. What the heck is wrong with it, right? And so I have IP and fully qualified domain name target export lists. So you can just download these. It'll dump it, essentially download it as an Excel. And then you can use that as your target list for vulnerability scanners, for application security tools, whatever it is, but it'll essentially give you your list of targets. Also, if you're a penetration tester, that's useful as well, right? As part of a discovery tool, and then getting essentially a target list to go and explore more. But in a nutshell, that's what the template is. But I thought it'd be interesting to show you what does the model actually look like behind the scenes. And so let's pull this up. Well, first thing we got to do is actually run. We got to run the dang thing. And let me check the chat real here. Uh, cheers for explaining. Yeah, yeah, totally. Jim, have you used social network analysis for over 25 years? I like it. Um, be good. Yeah, so it's definitely right. Um, a specific use case. The other thing in my experience too is graph databases are awesome when the use case needs them, but maybe overkill or especially from a computational standpoint when you don't need them. There's a reason a lot of folks use relational databases, but yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff you can do or you can really only do with graph databases. The other thing I've found with graph databases is it's really easy to whiteboard, right? Because you have nodes, you have it's basically a mind map essentially of how do we represent something. And that can actually be really easy to whiteboard, especially with folks that aren't like database administrators or engineers, and really easy to extend on. So that can actually be, I think, a benefit is it's easy to whiteboard with stakeholders, and I think it also represents how people think about data a little bit easier as well. So I feel like people think about stuff more in a mind map fashion than tabular data. And so I think that can actually be a benefit, but yeah, there's certainly pros and cons, but when you need it, you definitely need it. So any of that attack path analysis stuff, if you've seen any of that, where it's saying, hey, we can exploit a vulnerability here, and then pivot to this device, and they'll kind of graph that out with the different hops and the different steps, or Bloodhound. I think that was Jonathan gave that example earlier. When you need it, you need it. So there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with AMAS. I'm not the expert on it, but because we're just pulling from the database, you can kind of use it as much as you want. We can run stuff as simple as AMAS enum. We're going to do an output directory, throw it in this office hours um, folder so we can see what it's doing. So basically what we're saying here is we're going to enumerate all the assets. We're going to output the database in this path here. And then we'll do example.com. So D for domain. And we can do it as simple as that. Now, AMAS supports a ton of other stuff. So you can set up API credentials for, man, a ton of different services. I'm not doing any of that. I'm just showing you kind of a real easy example. But if you wanted a ton of different sources, you can do that as well. But we will run this and hopefully I didn't misspell anything. Yep, looks like it's running. So if we take a look here, we can see, all right, so set up a text document, and it'll actually create 3 documents in whatever folder we are essentially outputting it to, right? So we're outputting it to this office hours directory. First, it'll spin up a text file that's a log file. It'll spin up a text file that's like the output. So we'll see it'll actually start outputting. It'll take a little bit here, but it'll output to the command line. And then it's actually also going to set up a SQLite database. And that's what we're interested in, is that database. Now, if we want to run another enumeration, right? So how do you do continuous discovery and things like that? Is you essentially just target the same database. So it'll look in the directory, it'll say, hey, do we have a SQLite database? And there it is. If we do, we'll just connect to that and essentially update that. If we don't, we'll create one new. So we didn't have an AMAS database in this directory, so it created a new one. So if you have multiple clients too, you can just point it to different directories, and essentially you won't be mixing client data. But we can see it's starting to do its enumeration. So it's found some NS records, A records, and this will take a little bit of time to do a full enumeration. That's essentially what it looks like. And it's storing all this data in this SQLite database. So to save us time, I won't sit here. We'll run out of time if we let it run its full enumeration. We'll let it, I'll kind of cancel it there. But now we have this SQLite database. So let's go ahead. We will, oops, let me copy this as path. Got a job. No problem. Glad you could join. Hopefully there was something helpful here. And definitely would love feedback on what would be useful. Awesome. Yeah, have a good one, man. Um, Let me open up the attack surface discovery template. The other thing I found that's really useful, and when I was first creating these, I'm like, man, there's got to be a way to do this, is creating parameters. Oh, come on. It's open on. Okay, we're going to do a switcheroo. We are going to do a quick switcheroo. Is opening on my other monitor, and I actually cannot move it until I do. So let's do this. Let's hop over here. And then let's open this. Okay. I lost my chat for a little bit, but I will move it over. I'll move it over after this. Um, so essentially, when you open it up, the way I do all this is just by creating parameters. And then in the actual queries, everything's parameterized. And so all we're going to do is paste and my screen recording is messing up. It looks like that thing's staying up there. I'm removing the quotations here. So when I copy stuff by default, I'll put quotations. I'll click load. And then it'll connect to that database. I'll just use default Windows credentials because it doesn't need them. And then it's loaded up. So let me quickly re-switch this up so I can see the chat. And then I want to show the right display. There we go. Okay, so hopefully that's showing up. One of the benefits and one of the reasons I make these in Power BI and I don't create some SaaS software or something like that is a lot of folks, the software tools are great, but you kind of have to fit your processes or what you want to see to how that software tool works. And when I was doing research into GRC tooling, that's a lot of the feedback I got is, we tried it out, they're pretty useful, but they weren't flexible enough for us. So we ended up canceling the contract and we went back to PowerPoint, Excel, and SharePoint essentially, and Word and stuff like that. One of the benefits of Power BI is you can still get some of the fancy graphs and things like that that you're used to in software tools. But you also, when you open up the template, you get access to actually edit it. So I can edit any of these things if I want it to be, this won't make any sense, but like a line graph, I could do that. If I want to show something a little bit differently to someone, I also have access to the data model. If I want to add a new page and do a totally custom page or report, I can do that as well. And so that's really beneficial. I've seen it's always really cool. Sometimes someone will send me, hey, I got this template and I added this and this because we have this requirement where I work, and check it out. And, they've been able to edit it and mold it, the rest of the 15-20% of the way there. And that's always really cool to see. Now, my goal is where you don't have to, but the benefit is you can, right? You don't have to put in a feature request and be spending $10 million a year just for them to think about, adding your stuff to the roadmap. But when we look at the data behind the scenes, it's actually not quite as clean as you would think. Um, Hopefully this is still sharing. Yep. Um, so we actually have, and the way most graph databases will work is you'll have a node table. So that'll be a list of all your nodes and then your metadata about your nodes. So this assets table is essentially that. This is your nodes table. It has all of your nodes, um, what the value is. So this is actually kind of smushed together, the type, last seen. I'm generating showing links here. And then you have your relationship table as well. So we can see from node 1 to node 3, from node 1 to node 4, from node 1 to node 5, etc. This is all coming from that domain. I pulled in the source and the target here. So by default, the relations table is really just node 1 to node 3, node 1 to node 4. But I also pulled in the actual, like, what is the value there for the node as well. But it's rather straightforward. You can see it's parameterized here, so that's where it's pulling in the database we put in there. There is a calendar here, which is just a calendar table, and that lets us do some of the calendar switching and things like that. And then this migrations is just another table there that's kind of got some, you know, essentially a log of the database. That's another table. But it's rather straightforward. But because of that, once we connect into it, we can actually access this. It'll update. So if we refresh, we run another scan, the database is updated. It'll run that update. The only kicker is you do need a SQLite ODBC connector. It's not supported out of the box. There's no official supported drivers, which is crazy for me. But there are open source options. There are commercial drivers available if you need to go a commercial route there. But that's essentially kind of behind the scenes. Open if anyone's got any questions. I know we're also coming up on an hour already, so I really appreciate all the questions at the front end. That was really helpful and really awesome to kind of go down those rabbit paths. But yeah, if anyone has any questions on how I creating this stuff, it's really not that crazy. Part of the challenge is, okay, we have this data. How do we represent it in a way that's useful? Um, but yeah, no, I mean, really appreciate y'all kind of hopping on. Y'all are crazy. 24-hour, 48 notice. Yeah, sure, I'll go spend an hour. No idea what he's going to talk about, but we'll hop on. So I really appreciate y'all coming here. I'll probably hit y'all up for feedback on what was useful, stream feedback. Is this something you'd want to attend again? But yeah, trying to figure out how I can help all of you start implementing Power BI and starting to do the same thing for your own organizations and your own roles. So I think it's pretty cool stuff, and I've had a lot of fun so far. Back to regular scheduled programming. Yeah, that's a funny way to put it. So hopefully, at the very least, I was a nice little break in all of your Fridays. So at the very least, I'll take that. Is um, a nice little break. Power BI allow you to make public dashboards. So yeah, there's a lot of ways you can do that. The one thing, so you can, if you go, like if you've seen me put any of my like public demo links, or if you go on my website, there's a you can like see a live demo